So good morning, everyone. My name is David Herbinet. I'm Audit Leader for Mazars. And I want to tell you about our journey in relation to culture. A lot of people are talking about culture, and probably nobody knows what the answer is. It's a really important topic. It's a critical topic, but it's a really complex topic as well. So I'm not standing here pretending that we know all of the answers about culture. I just want to share our journey, our thoughts on culture, and just give you food for thought when you go back to your offices and your companies. The Mazars journey on culture started in 2013. We produced a sort of concept study on culture, which won us the international recognition with a global award for innovation in auditing. And that was, the journey started here, and what I'm going to present to you now is what happened since then and where we are today, because I think we are a lot more mature now and delivering actually cultural audit today compared to 2013, where it was more, ideas. So that's me. So why is culture important? I mean, we see culture all over, and I believe this morning that even in the context of Brexit, people raise the issue of culture as something being really important. So culture is important for essentially 4 key reasons. First of all, it is now on every regulator's agenda. So I don't know what sectors you represent here, but in particular in the financial services sector, really important. We're seeing, the FSB, Financial Stability Board, the FCA, really flagging culture as a really key priority. It's one of the 6 or 7 top priorities in the business plan of the FCA at the moment. Same for the Financial Stability Board. But it's now going beyond financial services, and especially you will all be aware of the work that the Financial Reporting Council is doing on culture. And I wanted to just to read a recent statement of Win Bischoff, who is the FRC's chairman. And he said, a healthy corporate culture leads to long-term success by both protecting and generating value in the UK economy. It is therefore important to have a consistent and constant focus on culture rather than wait for a crisis. A strong culture will endure in times of stress and change. So you can't hear it from anyone higher up than Win Bischoff, who is leading on the development of governance in the UK. And we all know that the development of governance in the UK has big ramifications in terms of development of governance internationally. So that's the regulatory landscape changing. The reporting landscape is changing too. We're seeing evolutions in governance codes, so again, back to the FRC. But for example, I don't know if you're aware, in the Netherlands, the new governance code has been published, and culture is a #1 priority in that governance code in the Netherlands. So, things are moving and moving fast. We're seeing the non-financial reporting initiatives, notably at European level, which again are putting the reporting on culture very high on the agenda. Integrated reporting and culture really sit well together, and increasing focus from parliaments internationally on, so from the political arena on culture. In relation to performance, culture is really, really important. And for us at Mazars, that's one of the key areas we're looking at. Not just see culture as something which, has to be looked at to prevent issues, but as an enabler, as something that enables stronger performance. We have an international economy where 80% of the value of corporates is made of intangibles, and intangibles and culture, are very, very closely aligned. We've got an economy where 80% of M&A deals fail to deliver value, mostly because the cultures don't match when the deal actually happens. We've got digital transformation all over, and large corporates needing to embrace the work of startups and the digital economy. And again, big cultural shocks there. And you all know the famous Peter Drucker quote on culture: eating strategy for breakfast. So culture really drives strategy and is a fundamental plank to any strategic drive. And then, of course, that's more the negative side of culture, but it is there. Lots of corporate mishaps. I didn't have enough of one slide to put them all, so I just put a selection there. Very big issues, and pretty much on all of them you can go back to some cultural issues. So Mazars has been working with Board Agenda, which is a European publication for boards, primarily focused on governance. And we've done a survey on board leadership in relation to corporate culture. The report is actually coming out today, so you're seeing it before anybody else. And we've worked with INSEAD in order to produce that. It's quite a significant survey. We've had more than 400 responses from board members from European companies, and I think it gives us really interesting insight into culture. So I'll just take you through some of the bigger findings in the survey. So culture is ranked third by boards in terms of importance. So culture is really important, and for you, something relevant. Boards see culture as more important than risk management. 40% of board members believe that they do not devote enough time to cultural issues. Okay, and only 20% of board members believe that they are spending enough time on the right amount of time on culture. So that's despite the fact that culture is really important, as we've described, boards are not spending enough time on it. A third of board members are not confident that they have the right information to be able to understand the difference between the desired culture and the actual culture in the business. And only 5% of board members are very confident that there is clear alignment between the culture of the business and between the desired culture in the business and the actual culture of the business. Half of the board members say that there are significant gaps between strategy and culture. In relation to managing the risks in the business associated with culture, to summarize this, a third of the board members do not routinely consider risk associated with culture. So again, a big gap here. And directors are really struggling to get valuable and meaningful information to assess culture in their organization. Most people look at customer feedback or employee feedback, so survey type information. And only 25%, again probably quite relevant for you, only 25% of board members receive information from their internal or external auditors in relation to culture. So I don't know if that speaks to you in terms of what you're seeing in your organizations, but I think they're quite meaningful findings. So let's move on to culture. Just a summary, a lot of people talk about culture. It's quite difficult to pin it down in terms of giving it a definition or explaining what it is. And I don't think that we actually need a definition for culture technically. I think we just need to understand the impact of culture and where it's coming from. So culture is really part of a triptych. You've got the aspiration and vision of the business, you've got the strategy of the business, and you've got the organizational culture of the business. And everything fits together. And all of these are interdependent. When we try to define culture, I think it's helpful to, first of all, define what culture is not. And there are a lot of misconceptions out there about culture. So if you look at the bottom half of this page, which I think is the most relevant, culture is not risk culture. All financial services entities have got risk culture programs, and the regulator is all over risk culture. Risk culture is only an element of culture. You haven't covered culture if you only focus on risk culture. Culture is not integrity. Integrity is a value. Values form part of the cultural framework, but values are not per se the definition of culture. Again, in the financial services sector, culture is not conduct. Conduct is only an element of culture. And culture is not static. Culture evolves over time. Culture is contextual. And when business evolves, culture evolves too. Culture is not uniform either. You know, you've got, in any given business, you will have very different cultures, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think it's important to understand that it is multifaceted. It is country-specific, clearly. It is team-specific. It is leader-specific at times. The approach we're taking on culture is that we refuse to talk about good and bad culture. We don't think that there is a good culture or a bad culture beyond, of course, issues of integrity and ethics and things like that, which, of course, define what could be a bad culture. But good culture depends on the alignment between the culture of the business and what it's trying to do, to make sure that the behaviors of the people in that company are aligned with the strategic objectives. I think we don't like to talk about good or bad culture. We prefer to talk about strong culture. And for us, a strong culture is a culture that has homogeneity and intensity. Homogeneity means that people in a given part of the business, going back to several cultures, all behave in the same way. And intensity means that they actually feel and live the culture. Lots of research has taken place on culture, and they all show that a strong culture is absolutely critical to driving sustainable performance. Okay, there's no doubt about that. But they also show that having a strong culture is not sufficient to drive strong long-term performance. So it is a clear enabler, but it's not sufficient. And a lot of research as well, and I'm not pretending that Mazars has sort of come up with this analogy, but a lot of research also shows the similarities between culture and biology, and especially living organisms. So, if I have to give a definition of culture, I like to say that culture is the immune system of the organization. And the way it works is that in biology, you've got a virus called an antigen that enters the body and sending a message to the body saying, I'm attacking you. And then this message triggers a chain reaction where you have the body creates antibodies. And the antibodies fight the antigen. And then it's this combination of antigen and antibodies that creates the immune system. And I will build the bridge between that biology analogy and culture in organizations, and how we have used that framework to define a process and a methodology to be able to audit culture. So our approach to culture is really building on this antigens and antibodies. Sorry. So in any organization, you've got this antigen-antibody reaction. And if you talk about cultural aspects, you've got cultural triggers and then responses within the organization. And it's a combination of the triggers and the responses that form that define the organizational culture, the corporate culture. Okay? So triggers are based on, as you can read here, are based on choices made by the company and its leaders. So it includes a number of elements, and I will expand a little bit more on what we include here. And responses are how people respond to these triggers. Certain triggers may provoke certain reactions, strong or less strong, but they all have an impact on people working in the organization. Okay, and again, I will explain that in a bit more detail. But that's the core frameworks that we've been using to define an approach to culture. So that is very much our approach and methodology. We've called it the cultural compass. And our approach is based on 6 dimensions of culture, which you can read on the screen. Decision making, structures and controls, people development, attitudes and behaviors, leadership and management, and values, mission and purpose. And within each of these dimensions, we've defined a number of variables. At this point in time, we've got about 60 variables, which are either triggers or responses, and that help us to analyze culture in organizations. To oversimplify, I think the detail is a little bit more complex than that, but to simplify, triggers come mostly from 4 dimensions: values, mission and purpose, structures and controls, people development, and leadership and management. So most of the variables here are triggers, i.e. they have an influence on how people behave. And then in terms of reactions or responses, it's mostly 2 dimensions. Decision making, so the way that people make decisions on a day-to-day basis in their organization. So that's a response. And attitudes and behaviors, so clearly how people behave in the organization. Okay, so the model is very much generic. It's 6 dimensions, 60 variables, and the challenge in terms of using it is really in tailoring the 60 variables to the specific needs of a particular business, and I will give you a few examples on that. So the methodology we follow, and clients and companies that we talk to really like our approach and our framework, because we really come at it with an audit mindset. And we recently won a very interesting cultural review for a major central bank in Europe. And they said, for once we're able to understand how the audit process for culture was going to take place. Most of the people we meet to talk about culture are HR specialists or consultants, and we wanted something far more tangible to audit culture, and we found it with the Mazars methodology. So the first step is to really understand the objectives of the organization. The organization may have many different objectives when they want to review culture. They may want to reinforce performance, to reduce risks in the business, or lots of other reasons. And I think it's really important to understand the context in order to tailor the approach to the specific needs of the company. Then the biggest challenge, and that's one that we usually that we struggle the most with, is to help the company that we work with define its desired culture, and that's often a stumbling block for this sort of reviews, because if the objective is to compare desired culture to an actual culture, you need a starting point. Like in any audit, you need to know what your reference framework is. And most companies today, and I think the survey that I showed you earlier demonstrate that, most companies are really struggling to define their desired culture. They haven't done it, and when you ask them to do it, they don't know how to do it. So that's a big part of the methodology, is to work with them to frame the desired culture. Because only once you frame the desired culture, you can start working on comparing that with what's actually happening in the business. Then we have, once we understand what the desired culture is, we can spend time on analyzing the cultural triggers. So we take the framework, the 6 dimensions, the 60 variables, and we select from the 60 variables those that are most relevant to the desired culture. And we do a mapping between the framework and the desired culture of the company. And then we look at the cultural triggers. I'll give you a few examples. But this is really the audit part of the methodology, because if there is a trigger, it's like in biology, if there is an anti-gene, you can track it, you can follow it, it leaves a trace. Okay, so to analyze cultural triggers, you're able to go back to source documents, to some actual evidence in the business, and that enables you to have a fact-based audit in relation to culture. And that's really one of the key characteristics of this approach, is that it is fact-based. It is not sort of a esoteric or just looking at what people think. It's really looking at the hard stuff. So you can look at, you know, lots of things. You can see some of that here. So governance documents you can look at, especially in the people development side of things. There is lots you can review around, you know, appraisals, around exit interviews, around recruitment notes, and all these sort of things. You know, very, very rich in terms of triggers. Then once we've looked at the triggers, we can start thinking about how people should respond if they are subjected to these triggers. So we make assumptions on likely responses, likely cultural responses, and then we go and validate these with, you know, by confronting our assumptions to what people think and live in the business. So we can do that through surveys, interviews, focus groups, and lots of other ways, but that's really an interactive step in the process where we confront our assumptions to what people actually live and breathe. And then once this is all done, we can form an overall opinion, going back to our tool, and I will show you some examples of that. And then deliver recommendations, because one of the real advantage of this approach as well is because you're looking at triggers. If you have gaps at the end on your overall opinion, you're able to track back all of the gaps, all of the variances between desired culture and actual culture. You can track it back to a cause, to a trigger. And then the business can do some work on fixing these triggers to realign desired and actual. So these are a few examples just to illustrate the point. This is looking at triggers, essentially. So under leadership and management, for example, one of the variables is called source of authority. And in order to test that, we can look at organizational structure, we can look at management processes. What we're trying to measure in relation to this variable is whether the business on a scale, whether, you know, at one end of the scale you've got an autocratic business, at the other end of the scale you've got a principle-based business. Okay? And this review enables us to sort of position the cursor on this measurement range, and based on that, we can start to make assumptions on responses. So you can see a few examples there. You know, again, appraisals and development as one of the variables under the people development dimension. Again, you can look at lots of things and actually test that. And there are lots of interdependencies between, of course, all of the variables. And it's important to look at these interdependencies too. So the previous page was around triggers, and then we can look at responses. You know. So for example, we look at one of the variables under decision making is time orientation. So based on your analysis and understanding of the triggers, you can form an assumption on whether people, if they have to make a decision, will be looking more at long-term or short-term orientation. And then you can confront that to actual surveys or discussions or interviews or focus groups. And same for, you know, pressure intensity, goals and behaviors and so forth. And at the end, that's sort of on one of the dimensions. This one is on decision making. You can build this map, you know, between A, which is a target culture, the desired culture, and B, which is the actual culture that you've been able to really see in the business. And you can see that, for example, on acceptance of failure, you've got really strong alignment. On pressure intensity, not so strong alignment. But then, having done that, on pressure intensity, for example, you can go back to the triggers which lead to this outcome and feed that back to the company so that they can work on the triggers to bring closer alignment on the outcome. So, in summary, in terms of our approach, it's really looking at the differences between target culture and desired and actual culture. And the use cases for this methodology are essentially in two areas. One is helping boards really understand where they're at in their business between these two dimensions. I think there is also a really interesting use case around M&A. You saw earlier the statistics that 80% of M&A deals don't deliver the value expected. A lot of the time because of cultural misalignment, and this tool can also be applied in the context of M&A transactions to prepare the integration of the two businesses. Okay, it's really fact-based, so it's not a consulting, an HR consulting assignment. It's really an audit approach where we look at facts and evidence. It is independent. We are not the objective of this, and I think that the way it can be applied is this is not done in order to sell advisory work on the back of it in order to fix the issues. We are there just to give a picture. That's why I called it Making Culture Visible. We're here to give a picture of the difference between desired and actual culture. And then there are lots of very clever consultants who can go and fix it. It's very tailored. Yes, there is a framework, but it's really tailored to the actual needs of the business and to the actual culture of the business. And last comment I wanted to make on this is that we don't pretend we are an audit firm. So a lot of people would say, what's your legitimacy to talk about culture? You're good at numbers and you're good at processes and controls, but culture that's a bit different, isn't it? So yes, we recognize that. We don't pretend that we are experts in culture, but we are experts in auditing, and we are experts at delivering a process that looks at facts and goes and comes to a conclusion. And we are getting help from a lot of people out there who are much better than we are at culture. And notably, there are a lot of very, very interesting startups out there working on in the field of neuroscience. And neuroscience has got many, many applications in relation to culture. And we are partnering with a number of them. They deliver very, very clever technology to be able to assess some of the responses, in particular with game theories and these sort of things. So there are lots of firms out there who we can work with, and therefore each one at its place. So that's essentially all I wanted to say. I think I'm just on time for 15 minutes of questions or comments or personal stories. Yes.
Well, first of all, can I say welcome to the real world. Auditors seem to be catching up at last about culture, which is gratifying. Can I just ask you, though, what about the culture of audit itself? Because, in fact, what you've described is something that many of us who've worked in this area before have been doing this for a long time. I mean, there may be not tools that have produced quite the exquisite accuracy that you're now bringing to bear. But the issue really is, are auditors generally, rather than just yourselves, in a space which really is taking into account culture in the first place? I mean, the culture of audit in the first place. I mean, I'm chair of an audit committee, and I'm very conscious of the fact that the questions that I'm beginning to ask are around, not about culture, because I know about culture and I can guide people about how to measure it or even whether it's worth measuring. What I'm really asking is, Well, are auditors with it? Do they cotton on to the fact that culture is so critical and that auditing can bring the kind of precision that I think you're talking about to the role that the audit committee has to play? Because in one sense, the audit committee can look backwards, which auditors have been doing for decades, right? So, you know, there's no problem in having auditors tell you, you know, these are the results we've uncovered. What seems to be missing, and what interests me, is how do you persuade auditors to actually look through the windscreen as opposed to the rear view mirror towards the future? And everything you're saying is obviously saying, well, we're doing that, but that may be you, but the majority of auditors are nowhere near that position. Their culture, if you like, is somewhat retrospective. And I wonder whether you've got a comment on that.
Obviously, I can't comment on what the other auditors are doing. I can explain why we're interested in this space, because again, as I explained before, it's not necessarily the natural space for auditors. What we see in the market is that most firms are investing massively in data analytics and in technology and these sort of things. And we took a step back and thought, well, is that going to be the answer to auditing? And you know, yes, machines are going to enable us to do more clever stuff, but fundamentally, you know, it's all about people. And there was nothing done by firms on this topic, and we really wanted to work on culture in order to cover that big issue. I'm personally convinced that working on culture is far more impactful in terms of being able to anticipate disasters or future issues than looking at, you know, technology and analytics. We recently did a hackathon with technology startups and so forth. And one of the particular aspects we looked at, I think that is very much in line with your question, was working on identifying signals. You know, when you do an audit, you want to pick up on the signals that are going to trigger potential problems in the future. And the image I use all the time, I don't know if any of you have watched a very good movie with Tom Cruise called Minority Report. But you know, you have sort of, can't remember what they're called, but you know, people in there who can see, you know, problems that are going to, crimes that are going to be committed in the future. And I really think that through culture we can sort of move in that direction a little bit and anticipate where problems may arise. So you know, we are passionate about this cultural dimension. We're also, of course, doing work on data analytics and machine learning, all these kind of things. But I think that's potentially far more impactful than technology. Yeah.
I've got a question in terms of the work that you've done with companies relating to then ownership of the recommendations coming from your analysis. So I'm part of an internal audit team, and one of the questions that we're struggling with is how actively we should drive that culture within the organisation, or how much we should look to the board to take ownership of it, bearing in mind that audit ideally should be independent of that executive decision-making responsibility. Just wondering, from your experience, what role do audit play in taking forward recommendations from your analysis?
Well, my experience from all of the discussions we've had and we're having on culture is that it's probably, of all of the topics you may want to talk about with a board or with a chairman or a CEO, that's by a very, very long way the biggest political minefield. And you know, many boards actually don't want to get too much visibility on culture because they are afraid of the consequences and what it will tell them, and they're afraid that they don't know how they will cope with it, how they will deal with it. In relation to your question on internal audit, you know, one of the big jobs we're currently doing, as I mentioned before, with this big central bank, is that in order to be able to deliver that audit of culture, we had to call it something other than audit, because the organization would have, not bought into the process. So it's an audit review. It's not a cultural audit. It's exactly the same thing, but I think language is really important, and the way that you frame it, and where the sponsorship is coming from is really, really critical to the success of the review. So in that case, it is our partner in the organization is the internal audit team, but they are very much sitting in the back seat, and it is fronted by the board of the organization. So I think internal audit have a big role to play, but I'm not convinced personally that we will go as far as we need to go if culture is fronted and led by internal audit.
Hi, I'm more interested in understanding the nature of the team who does these culture audits in Mazars. Are they from the internal audit team, or it's a specialist team? What sort of background do they have?
It's in order to deliver something like this, you need to bring really mixed teams. So again, I'll use just to stay on the same example. In that central bank, we've got part of the team. We've got banking experts, so consultants. Okay. We've got a combination of internal and external auditors. And I led this work alongside an internal audit specialist. I've got an external audit background. But you need very multidisciplinary teams for this kind of work, I think. It's not a big team though. You can do a pretty significant cultural review with 5 or 6 people.
How do you sell the idea that the audit of culture is important, where you face the resistance that you should stick to the processes and you should stick to transactions?
Again, it's leadership from the board. If your CEO doesn't believe in the importance of culture, then you'll get a really hard time to push it to the top of the agenda.
But
so,
what about the point that the board needs to see? Because you will get police CEOs who don't want this to be shown.
yeah.
So how do you make it a selling point? I don't know. I mean,
It's a really good question. It's a really good question.
because this is the point where you actually feel how strong is the internal audit voice
Hmm.
in comparison to management, the board, who will they really listen to?
Hmm.
Really.
And that's what the survey shows, that the board is actually not taking enough ownership of.
But I think the question
of
that's
culture.
really being asked, which I think you're not addressing
Sorry.
with respect,
No.
is that the starting point is a board that's willing to look at culture. I mean, it's all very well saying that the audit can contribute in the way that you're describing, but your starting point is exactly the one that you've not really addressed, really, which is how do you get a board to address the fundamentals of culture? If you can get them to that point, then it's easy to turn around and say, well, some of the best people to help you measure it are audit people, because they're very good at quantification, they're very good at numbers, they're very good at digital usage, at data analysis, and so on. So if you can hand it to them as a job, fine. But I think the starting point that you're being asked, which you haven't addressed, is how do you get the board in the first place to address the cultural issue? And until you can actually clarify that, you're left with the picture that I think we're getting is, well, you're very lucky. You seem to have a client who wants to talk about culture. I can think of many companies and boards don't want to talk about it, not just from fear. I mean, it's a good excuse to say that they're fearful, they're actually not very competent either, which makes them
Well,
feel-
yeah, okay. Yeah. I don't have the answer to that question. You know, you know how to fix dysfunctioning boards in organizations, I think, is a much bigger topic. For listed companies, you have the pressure of investors, and we are talking to a number of investors, and we know for sure that investors are really interested in asking questions of boards in relation to culture. But if you're in another markets or private companies and so forth, I don't know.
Okay.
But
we're getting signals.
Just one.
This one.
Just an observation on that question. I work closely with David on culture, and a number of FTSE 100s I work with, and so to answer the question a slightly different way, but those sort of companies I work with, the FTSE 100s, yes, there was some discussion at the board level, but I always think a highly performing internal function should take some of that responsibility as well. So with those companies I've been working with, we've taken themes from all the different audits we've done over the course of the year and started to highlight those cultural issues and things that have been coming up. So we're using that as a way to highlight that to the board, that actually they should start to think about this more and more. But from an internal audit function perspective, we are actually highlighting the key themes and linking things back to the culture and the tone from the top and the code of conduct within the organisation. So I think, yes, the board needs to take ownership, but us as being internal auditors have also got a role to play in that.
which is about the culture of auditing.
Yes.
There are people there standing behind you, telling us to now shut up. But that was very interesting, David. And I think we can see there's some growth in the profession, perhaps a new angle to the profession coming up. And it was very insightful. By all means, David is going to be around. So if we want to carry on the discussion further, there are we've got lounges outside. We can talk through this.
Pleasure.
Thank you for this very participation, the great participation from your side, and the questions were very key to what internal audit, the audit profession can do. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the 2 days. There are a lot of nice sessions going on, cutting edge technologies, audits, other topics. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.